Hey everybody, another GMG review. Today we're taking a look at the new injected thermoplastic Vostok for the Nomads that was kindly sent to me as a final product sample for free by Corvus Belli to check out their new material that they're using for Infinity miniatures. Now, if you haven't heard about this, and you're not really sure where this is coming from, one of the big things that's happened, not just because of the pandemic, but just because of the rising material costs in white metal, tin, and pewter, the cost of making metal miniatures has gone up in the last 10 years, like exponentially, like an insane amount, into the thousands of percent what it used to cost to make a metal miniature. And so where material costs weren't a huge part of miniature production before, it actually costs significantly more to cast stuff in white metal now than it did 10 years ago. To the point where if you have a very big metal model line, that is a significant thing. You saw companies dealing with this all through the last sort of like decade, even as like Privateer Press and other companies that were almost exclusively dealing in metal would slowly phase in resin and plastics into their product line. And the reason for that is big, physically imposing large miniatures cast completely in metal, simply material-wise cost more to produce, regardless of like how many points they are in your game or how they work on a system. And so it becomes this question mark of, if you are producing something that probably each of your customers is only going to buy one or two of, but it costs you more to make it than 6 of another thing that they might go and buy, and you're charging them almost the same amount for it, you've got a big problem in a large miniature line. And all kinds of companies have struggled with this. And so what Corvus Belli does in the last year is they've done a ton of research trying to figure out how they can best adapt to that. Because one of the things they're known for is very detailed, high quality, digitally sculpted miniatures, beautifully cast in metal. And they have, I think, as far as companies go, always walked an incredibly fine balance between being a game company and being a miniature company. And I think they've done a great job of always adding value to the people who love collecting and painting their toy soldiers and the people who love playing their games. And I would say, if I was to rank game companies in the top like 3 in the industry of trying to navigate that balance, Corvus Belli is probably, if not number 1, then in the top 2 of companies who always keep in mind that the toy soldiers are just as important as the gameplay for the game itself. And so this took this really seriously, and they researched a whole bunch of materials and ways of doing it, and they landed on injected thermoplastic. Now, injected thermoplastic isn't HIPS plastic. When people say plastic, they almost instantly default to that high-impact styrene stuff that you use polystyrene cement on. It's your model airplane plastic that is famous by Games Workshop. Companies like, Weird Miniatures use it. There's tons of companies, Warlord Games uses it. It tends to be the first thing people think of when they think of plastic. But plastic is actually any chemical compound that cools that's oil-based or petroleum-based. And injected thermoplastic is just another type of chemical reagent that can be injected into a mold. In this case, they're using rubber molds, magnetically held rubber molds to do it, and using traditional casting methods to make a 3D like injected model, basically. You have huge steel molds for HIPS styrene, that are incredibly expensive and hard to store and keep and work with, but they're used for like mass factory production, and that's where you get like your Games Workshop style plastics. These are done typically by hand, more like a spin casting, small room casting type thing, with this stuff being injected in usually as a reactant agent, a mixed chemical agent that will then harden inside the mold. Not necessarily through heat, because heat will potentially damage silicone and stuff like that, whereas steel, of course, it's not such a big deal. So let's take a look at this thing. Replacing the bigger miniatures in their model line is going to drastically reduce the amount of material put out versus the sort of like what it's worth in their product line. And that was what the decision was made. So in this sort of like cool little brief they sent me, they talked about some of the miniatures that are going to be coming out in this material in the future, things like the remotes pack for the Nomads, which of this is one of the Nomad remotes. The Jackbots, some cool Polaris Bear Pod that I'm very excited about. Basically, the cool new support stuff that's coming in this next wave is going to be phased in this injected thermoplastic, and stuff that is already currently in metal out there in the world will probably stay metal for a while, but may eventually join this if it's a large model thing. So they've sent me this one to check out, so let's open it up and have a look. All right, so here it is, injected thermoplastic. Let's pop this bad boy open. Now, I waited to do this review until I could get my hands on a second one of these to have one built and painted, because I wanted to be able to show you both. This is the final product. So we got our base, we have the body and fuselage. You can see here are some of the vents where the thermoplastic is actually injected into the mold. And then you can also see there's a little flashiness, some silvering on the hood, but if you look, my nail will scrape it off. That's why I said you don't want to necessarily use a hobby knife to cut into this stuff. You can use a flat edge of something that's hard like your nail, or like a back of a knife. There's legs, they slot together in two parts. This is a pretty traditional build style for the remotes for Infinity. Obviously I'm not cleaning, I'm purposely leaving the vents on these guys so you guys can see them. So it's just gonna kind of sit together on this base, as opposed to being, you know, more assembled. I'm not gonna try and assemble it in front of you. The rest of the fuselage there you can see. Now the one weird thing is this little domey piece in the front was actually separate on the final production one that I built from Crimson Stone, and this just sits on top of here. Then we have this little fairing that goes on the one side. We have his Mark 12, which goes on the other side. And you can see it does bend slightly. This material, it's funny, it's not brittle, it's a bit bendy, which I think is nice. And there's not a lot of mold lines from the actual mold closing on these either. So there it is. So there's the one that's unassembled. So you can see there are vents. Obviously, there's the points where the thermoplastic gets shot into the mold, and it comes in a grand total of 5 pieces. But I will say, having built one of these now, oh my God, one, any little like corrections you need to do, you can use a bit of hot water to correct, but also the gluing it together of this was way easier, and that resulted in this guy. And here he is. This is the actual Vostok from my Beyond Crimson Stone expansion pack that I built and painted. And I thought it was really important to have had experience the final one before I took a look at this one that they sent, just to make sure that they were as close to the same as humanly possible, and also so I could have some experience with it before I actually talked about it. I wanted to have one I could show that was unbuilt and one that was actually finished off, and this is the one I finished off. So this is the Vostok with the Mark 12, same exact miniature. The one slight difference was that this finished one, the domey sort of like headpiece was a separate piece, probably just for like casting purposes to make it easier to cast. And I painted this up using the Nomad paint set. You can see this on the paint table this week. But once he was cleaned up, almost no mold lines. Super easy to paint, took primer super well. I used a basic rattle can from the hardware store, paint plus primer from Rust-Oleum, and then airbrushed it with some Imperial Hobbies paints and some Vallejo paints. And that's the result. And if you look at the detail quality, let's compare him to somebody else. Let's compare him to one of my Sierras. This is a metal Sierra from my Pano line. I would say the edges are just as crisp. The detail fidelity, depth of detail is just as good. And unless you picked these up, if you were playing the whole like one of these things is not like the other game, I don't think you would know which of these was metal and which of these was plastic. I also put them next to one of my larger ones, which is from my my Varun army. This is a, oh geez, this is another Pano one. I forgot its name. It's got a Spitfire and ODD. It's almost the same as the Vostok, but with a Spitfire. Oh geez, not the Sierra, it's a name I've forgotten, ODD remote. But same size base. He's actually a bit smaller, if you look at him, than the Vostok is. Just like height-wise, not as chunky, and takes, you know, up the base like not quite as well. So one thing I'm kind of excited about is by using this injected thermoplastic, you can have some kind of more base-filling miniatures that kind of accurately portray what they're supposed to be on the battlefield. This guy looks like he's 2 structure and armor 3, because he is. He's a beast. The Vostoks are amazing in the game. And so there it is. So things I learned. 1. Actually, let's do a left-right list. So left-right. So things that were great about this. It was super easy to clean up. The gluing of this together required no pinning. It was super easy with just like standard cyacrylate glue, cyanoacrylate. So I said that too fast and it all blurred together. If you're wondering what that means super glue for people not using fancy chemical terms. It's light, so my magnets on my bases are going to keep it from like rattling around in my magnetic trays in my carrying cases, which is kind of cool. And I found him not annoying to paint because his details were nice and he took paint properly. There won't be any chipping for the most part, I doubt, because the primer adhered really nicely to the thermoplastic. And yeah, and he's got a flex to him as opposed to like a brittleness to the resin. So I think that's really cool too. Things I was concerned about. 1, you can cut too deep on resin. This is just for people who've never worked with resin miniatures before. If you're working exclusively with metal miniatures at Corvus Belli, well, I honestly use clippers to remove the vents and try using the back of your hobby knife instead of the sharp side. Be careful, obviously, don't stick your thumb on it and cut yourself. But use the back to scrape the mold lines first. You will get a lot of miles out of backblading something, and you won't accidentally cut too deep in because it's a lot softer probably than you're used to. It is resin, so it's not quite as tough. The end of that Mark 12 may break off at some point if I'm not careful with it. If I stick it in, if I really crunch it in a carrying case too. but it didn't feel flimsy. It felt bendy enough that I wasn't worried about bumping into it. And that is one thing with resin miniatures, especially 3D printed resin ones. You can have details where you're afraid that if you breathe on it too hard, they might just snap off. I'm not worried about that with this miniature. But it is resin, so it is a little bit less robust than metal is. And 3, it's awesome in the game. So overall, my review, I'm excited about this, mostly because the bigger a metal miniature is, the harder it is to sit and glue together, just because the weight of it's pulling it apart. I think this is a good move for them financially, and I like it when our company does anything that's just a smart investment in their future to stay solvent, so I can keep playing their game for years and years. So I'm happy this is happening. Obviously, it's an adjustment for people that like metal miniatures. Obviously, it's an adjustment for people that like plastic miniatures or haven't worked with resin before. And that may take some adaptation, but you can research and adapt. I'm also very happy that they've remained just as committed to people who love building and painting their toy soldiers as the people who like playing their games, because I think the balance of that is the difference between a successful miniature game company and one that runs away too far into one part of the overlapping Venn diagram of their customers of things people like. So good job, Corvus Belli. Thanks for sending it to check out. Hope you guys liked this review and just being able to have a closer look at it. Until next time, I'm Ash. Have a good day. Hey there, I hope you enjoyed that video. There are tons of other games already recorded for you to watch. Click over to my channel page if you haven't already, and have a look through the dozens of playlists full of videos. I guarantee you'll discover a game you haven't seen played before. I put out new videos 7 days a week, and every day is themed to a different genre as I continue to explore the wider world of gaming. Of course, none of that's possible without you, the viewer, so click a like and subscribe if you'd like to stay on top of what's happening here daily. My 2 kids and I are massively grateful to be able to have the flexibility of this job so I can always maximize my time with them. If you want to support me continuing to put out this content, it's only possible because of my amazing backers on Patreon who support the studio, equipment, and model cost, as well as being how I make the bulk of my living. You can also help out by buying a t-shirt through Spreadshirt, a measuring gauge or widget from Death Ray Designs, or buying one of my games and supplements like Last Days, Gamma Wolves, and Blaster. As a way of showing my appreciation, patrons get early access to new games and supplements that I write throughout the course of the year. Huge thanks for watching, it really does help out, and happy gaming.